By 11 o'clock in the morning, the water itself was on fire. A wooden steamboat, 3 decks high, was driving up the East River with flames pouring out of her bow, and she was not slowing down. She was speeding up. On her decks were more than 1,300 people, and almost every one of them was a woman or a child. Many of them could not swim. The life preservers they reached for would not hold them up. Some of those preservers had been filled with iron. Before that boat came to rest, more than 1,000 of those people would be dead. It happened in New York City, in broad daylight, a few hundred yards from shore, in front of a crowd of witnesses who could do nothing but watch. And it stood as the deadliest single day in the history of New York for 97 years, until the 11th of September, 2001. The counts have never fully agreed. The official tally taken in 1904 recorded 959 dead. The figure most often cited since is 1,021. Historians still dispute the exact number because there was no passenger manifest, and no one ever knew precisely how many had crowded aboard that morning. But even the lowest honest count is more than 900 people. Set against the 2,977 killed on 9/11, it remains the second worst day New York has ever had, and you have almost certainly never heard of it. This is the story of the General Slocum, how they died, who was warned, and who answered for it. To understand what was lost, you have to understand who was on that boat. They came from a neighborhood on the Lower East Side of Manhattan that no longer exists. In 1904, it was called Little Germany, Klein Deutschland, and it was one of the largest German-speaking communities in the world outside of Europe itself. Its heart was a church, St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church on 6th Street. Every June, the church chartered a steamboat and took its congregation up the coast for a Sunday school picnic to mark the end of the school year. In 1904, it was the 17th year they had done it. For the families of St. Mark's, this was the biggest day of the year. The mothers packed baskets of food. The children wore their good clothes. A band was hired. The destination was a grove on Long Island, a few hours away by water. Because it was a weekday, the fathers were mostly at work. So the boat that pulled away from the pier at the foot of 3rd Street that morning carried overwhelmingly women and their children. Whole Sunday school classes boarded together. More than 1,300 people out for a day in the sun. The boat they boarded was called the General Slocum. She was a side-wheel paddle steamer, 13 years old, built in 1891. She was made almost entirely of wood, coated in fresh paint and oil, and she was, though no one aboard knew it, one of the most dangerous places in the city of New York. Here is what the passengers could not see. Somewhere in the forward part of the ship was a small room where lamp oil, straw, and oily rags were stored. That was the fuel. All it needed was a spark. Against that fuel, the ship's defenses were a fiction. The fire hose was a length of cheap linen that had rotted where it lay coiled. When the crew finally turned the water on it, it burst. And then there were the life preservers. There were thousands of them aboard, tucked into overhead racks, exactly where you would expect a safe ship to keep them. They had been installed when the ship was built in 1891. In 13 years, not one had been replaced. Inside their canvas covers, the solid cork had crumbled into useless powder. Worse, the company that made them, the Nonpareil Cork Works, had a problem. Cheap granulated cork did not weigh enough to pass the federal regulation. So to make the weight, they had slipped bars of iron inside. Life preservers filled with iron. On the day it mattered, mothers would tie these onto their children and watch the iron carry them straight down. None of this was hidden from the authorities. Just weeks before the picnic, a federal steamboat inspector named Henry Lundberg had inspected the General Slocum and certified her and all of her safety equipment as sound. Under oath, later, he would admit that he had not actually examined the equipment at all. There had been no fire drills. The mostly untrained crew had never once practiced what to do if the ship caught fire. So here is what we know, watching from more than a century away, that the people on that boat did not. The ship was a stack of dry timber and oil. Its hose would burst. Its life jackets would sink. Its crew did not know what to do. And its inspection had been a signature on a piece of paper. They only knew it was a beautiful morning and that the band was playing. The fire began somewhere forward in the paint and lamp room, most likely from a discarded match or cigarette. It found the straw and the oil, and it moved fast. There was a warning early when it might still have mattered. A boy of 12 saw the flames and ran to tell a deckhand. He was gruffly chased away, waved off as a prankster. By the time the crew understood that the fire was real, it was already beyond them. When they reached for the rotten hose, it split in their hands. The fire climbed into the fresh paint and ran up through the wooden decks. Word reached the captain, William Van Schaik, several minutes in. And here the disaster turned from an accident into a catastrophe. The Slocum was in the narrow, treacherous stretch of the East River near Hellgate. There were places Van Schaik could have run her aground almost at once, putting her nose on a mud bank while the passengers were still forward, away from the flames. Instead, he ordered full speed ahead, and he held it, full speed into the wind. A boat racing forward creates its own wind. Driving full speed into a headwind turned the whole ship into a chimney. The flames, which had started at the bow, were blown back along the length of the vessel, straight into the crowds of women and children pressed toward the stern. Every second at speed fed the fire. Van Schaik would later say he feared that beaching her along the built-up shoreline would set fire to buildings and oil tanks and spread the disaster to the city. Whatever his reasoning, he ran the burning ship more than a mile, past shorelines where he might have grounded her, before finally driving her onto the rocks off North Brother Island. By then, there was no ship left to save. The passengers were caught between fire and water. Those who stayed aboard burned. Those who jumped, in the long, heavy skirts and layered clothing of 1904, mostly drowned, many of them dragged under by the very life preservers meant to save them. Mothers went into the river with children in their arms. North Brother Island was not an ordinary place to come ashore. It held a quarantine hospital, Riverside Hospital, where the city isolated people with typhoid and other contagious diseases. As the burning ship bore down on them, the hospital's staff and even its patients ran to the water. Nurses threw out ropes and debris for people to cling to. Some dove in and pulled the badly burned from the river by hand. Nurses and patients formed human chains into the water to reach the drowning. One hospital worker, Pauline Puetz, swam out again and again and pulled a child from the churning paddle wheel. Tugboats and other vessels drove into the wreckage to haul people out. They saved everyone they could reach. It was not nearly enough. It was over in a matter of minutes. Of the more than 1,300 who had boarded that morning, only about 321 lived. An entire community, gathered on one boat for the best day of its year, was gone. And then came the reckoning, or what passed for one. President Theodore Roosevelt ordered a federal commission to investigate. Its findings were damning, and they were specific. The vessel had been dangerously inflammable. The life-saving equipment was rotten and inadequate. The crew had been untrained and had never held a fire drill. Point by point, the commission described a disaster that the system was built to prevent and had waved through instead. Indictments came down against 8 men: Captain Van Schaik, 2 federal steamboat inspectors, and the president, the secretary, the treasurer, and the commodore of the Knickerbocker Steamship Company, which owned the boat. The executives of the Nonpareil Cork Works, the firm that had weighted the life jackets with iron, were indicted too. Now watch who actually answered. The inspector, Henry Lundberg, whose signature had certified the ship, was tried for manslaughter 3 separate times. He was never convicted. The Nonpareil Cork Works, whose iron-loaded life preservers had pulled children to the bottom of the river, saw its people indicted. None of them were convicted. The Knickerbocker Steamship Company, which had owned and operated a floating fire trap and, the evidence suggested, may have falsified its inspection records, paid a fine. A relatively small one. No one from the company went to prison. In the end, out of 8 indicted men and an entire chain of failure that ran from the cork factory to the inspection office to the company boardroom, exactly one person was convicted of anything: Captain William Van Schaik. He was found guilty on a single count of criminal negligence for failing to run fire drills and maintain his equipment, and sentenced to 10 years. He served about 3.5 of them at Sing Sing before he was paroled. In 1912, President William Howard Taft pardoned him. So the final accounting stands like this: more than 1,000 people dead, 1 conviction, 3.5 years served, and a pardon. Which leaves the last question. If more than 1,000 people died in daylight in the middle of America's largest city, why have you never heard of it? Part of the answer is that there was almost no one left to keep the memory alive. The dead were not scattered across a nation. They were drawn, block by block, from a single small neighborhood. The General Slocum did not just kill 1,000 people. It killed a community. That evening, fathers came home from work to apartments that were simply empty, their wives and children gone in a single afternoon. Entire Sunday school classes had disappeared at once. In the years after, the grieving survivors and the widowed fathers left Little Germany. They could not bear to stay among the empty rooms. The neighborhood that had filled that boat simply dissolved and scattered uptown. And Kleindeutschland faded off the map of New York. There was no lobby of survivors to demand remembrance because the disaster had erased the very people who would have done the remembering. And time did the rest. Within a decade, the world was consumed by a war, and a new century filled up with larger catastrophes. The General Slocum, a local tragedy with almost no one left to speak for it, slipped quietly out of the national memory.
It did leave something behind. The sheer scale of it forced a hard look at steamboat safety and inspection, part of the slow, grinding process by which the rules that govern passenger vessels were made real instead of merely written. Reforms were paid for, as they so often are, entirely in advance. The Slocum's own remains were stripped down and rebuilt into a barge, which later sank in a storm. On North Brother Island, where she burned, nature has taken the ruins back. In Middle Village, Queens, a monument marks a mass grave, and for years a dwindling group of survivors met each June to remember. In Tompkins Square Park, where Little Germany once lived, a small stone fountain still stands, carved with the faces of a boy and a girl looking out at the water, and the words, "They were Earth's purest children, young and fair." More than 1,000 people boarded a boat on the best morning of their year, trusting that the men who ran it, inspected it, and equipped it had done their jobs. Almost none of those men had. When it was over and the accounting was done, one captain served 3.5 years, and everyone else walked away. Nobody was warned in time. And in the end, for almost all of it, no one answered. If this story moved you, and if you believe these people are worth remembering, take a moment to follow this channel, share this video with someone, and subscribe, so the next forgotten disaster finds you too. Until then,